What if the only way to save your son was to work for a man who no longer wanted to live, and in the silence of that mansion, you met the love of your life? Jessica slammed the door shut for the last time. There were no shouts, no pleas for forgiveness, just the bitter silence of someone who no longer belonged to that place. Her parents didn't even look at her. Her mother's eyes were filled with shame, while her father, he just pointed to the street without uttering a word. She pressed her thin coat tight against her body, trying to push away the cold that came from within, far colder than the rain soaking her clothes. With one hand on her belly, she took the first step into the unknown, not knowing where to go, with no place to return to. Her mind echoed with her mother's words, "You've ruined your life. There's no place for you here anymore." The street was nearly empty, with only a few cars speeding by, indifferent to the 19-year-old girl who had just lost everything. Her legs trembled, and it wasn't just from the cold. She couldn't afford to despair, not now. The baby inside her needed a roof, food, safety, but where could she find all that when she was alone in the world? Jessica walked for hours, aimlessly. Her phone was dead, and even if it had been working, there was no one to call. Her college friends had disappeared as soon as she announced the pregnancy, and as for her relatives, none of them had offered help. They all had the same speech. "You made your choice. Now deal with the consequences." Her eyes burned with exhaustion when she spotted a park bench and sat down, out of breath. The cold wind cut through her wet skin, and her body begged for rest. But sleeping on the streets was not an option. She needed to act. That's when she saw a small cafe still open across the street. She stood up and crossed quickly, without thinking. The bell on the door jingled as she entered, and a waitress looked at her curiously. "Can I get you anything, miss?" Jessica hesitated. She wanted to say she needed everything, a shelter, a job, someone to look at her without judgment. But there was no time for lamentations. "A coffee, please," she asked, trying to ignore the pain in her chest. She paid with the last coins she found in her pocket, and as she held the warm cup between her fingers, she picked up an old newspaper someone had left on the table beside her. She quickly flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words as if her life depended on it. That's when she found the ad, looking for a caregiver for a residence, accommodation included, contact Mrs. Karen. Her heart raced. There were no details about the salary, who needed care, or any other requirements. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what was written in bold, accommodation included. Without thinking twice, she borrowed the waitress's phone and dialed the number. "Anderson Residence," a firm voice answered. "Hi, my name is Jessica. I saw the ad about the caregiver position. Is it still available?" The woman on the other end paused for a few moments before replying, "Do you have experience?" "I have determination." Another pause. Jessica closed her eyes, praying that this wouldn't be another dead end. "Come tomorrow morning," the woman finally said. "Write down the address." She scribbled the address on a napkin with trembling hands. The next morning, she wore her only dry clothes and took a bus to the location. The city looked different from that window, as if it belonged to another world Jessica had never known. When she got off, she found herself standing in front of an imposing mansion, surrounded by iron gates and a tall fence that seemed impenetrable. She took a deep breath before pushing it open. The cold iron trembled under her fingers, and with a heavy creak, the entrance swung open. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gripped her backpack strap, as if it might give her courage. Beyond the gate, a long stone path led to the mansion's main entrance. The house, surrounded by dry trees and a neglected garden, looked like it belonged in an old movie. It wasn't a welcoming place, but Jessica had no choice. When she reached the door, she hesitated before knocking. Moments later, firm footsteps echoed from the other side, and the door opened. A woman with a rigid expression stared at her. "You've arrived." No smile, no friendly greeting, just those words, heavy with indifference. Jessica felt a lump in her throat. The woman, who could only be Mrs. Karen, the housekeeper, assessed her from head to toe before turning and walking away. "Come in." Jessica obeyed without saying a word. The inside of the mansion was as cold as its exterior. The marble floor gleamed, and the furniture, though old, was immaculate. There was an absence of life, as if time had stopped. "Before anything else, I want to make it clear that we do not tolerate tardiness, laziness, or interference with the employer's affairs," Karen said without looking at her. "You'll have a servant's room, simple meals, and a modest salary. But you'll have a roof. And I suppose in your condition, that's enough." Jessica swallowed hard. There was no compassion in the housekeeper's voice, only the cold acknowledgement of a fact. "Now, come meet Mr. Anderson." She followed Karen down a long hallway until they reached a large double door. Karen knocked once before entering. "She's here," she announced, stepping aside so Jessica could enter. Inside the room, the light was dim, and the smell of medicine and aged wood hung in the air. Near the window, a man sat in a wheelchair. He didn't turn when she entered. He simply sat there, motionless, staring at nothing. Jessica didn't know what to expect, but the silence was suffocating. "Mr. Anderson, this is Jessica," Karen said. The man didn't look at her. His voice came out hoarse, cold, as if each word were an unnecessary effort. "Take her to the room." Karen hesitated but obeyed. The door to the room closed behind Jessica with a sharp thud. The silence of the house weighed on her like a suffocating blanket, making every sound, no matter how small, feel like a threat to the fragile balance she was desperately trying to maintain. The room where she would spend her nights was small, poorly lit, and devoid of any comfort. The thin mattress sagged in the center, and the sheets smelled of long storage, as if no one had slept there for a long time. The walls were bare, cold, lacking any personality. Only a small dresser and an old wardrobe filled the space, but Jessica didn't mind any of that. As she sat on the edge of the bed, taking off her soaked shoes, she realized her body was exhausted. But the real fatigue didn't come from the walk, the rain, or the weight of her pregnancy. It came from the emptiness, from the rejection. She closed her eyes for a moment, but the memory of that night came back like a sharp blade. Her father's hard face, her mother's desolate expression, the coldness with which they had kicked her out. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't understand how her parents' love could disappear so suddenly. Or had it never existed the way she believed? She felt a tightness in her chest and placed her hand on her belly as if trying to protect the baby from the pain. He was all she had left. She lay down, trying to find a comfortable position, but every time she closed her eyes, the weight of the memories kept her from resting. The cold crept through the gaps in the window, making the night feel even longer. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the hard mattress or the temperature that kept her awake. It was the feeling of being utterly alone. When she finally drifted off to sleep, it was light and fragmented. Every noise made her heart race, and before she even felt like she had truly slept, a knock on the door woke her. "Your employer takes his coffee at 7 sharp, Karen called from the other side, not waiting for a reply before walking away. Jessica ran her hands over her face and slowly sat up, feeling the weight of fatigue still clinging to her body. She couldn't afford to break down. She got up and made her way to the kitchen, where an older maid had already prepared the coffee and Daniel Anderson's medication. The tray was set up as if it were part of a meticulously followed morning ritual. "Good luck," the woman said without meeting her eyes. "He doesn't like conversation." Jessica nodded and made her way through the mansion's halls. With each step, she felt the tension building. What would she find when she opened that door? When she entered Daniel's room, the first thing she noticed was the lack of light. The heavy curtains blocked any trace of sunlight, leaving the space in a perpetual twilight. The smell of medicine mixed with the aroma of old books was overpowering. He was there, sitting in the wheelchair near the window, but didn't turn to look at her. He seemed lost in his thoughts, so still that for a moment Jessica wondered if he had fallen asleep, sitting up. "Your coffee," she said, placing the tray on the table beside him. He didn't even glance at her. He merely murmured, his voice hoarse and devoid of emotion, "Bring what I asked for and don't say anything more." The coldness in his words made something twist inside Jessica. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to treat her like a ghost. Her family had done it, her friends, all those who pretended to care and then left her alone. But she wasn't invisible. She swallowed the retort that burned in her throat and simply stepped away, showing no emotion. But inside, her indignation grew. In the days that followed, Jessica carried out her tasks without complaint. She brought the coffee and medication, cleaned the room, changed the sheets. But every morning, Daniel continued to act as though she didn't exist. Then, one quiet afternoon, while she was sweeping the floor of his room, she noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. His gaze on her belly. It was quick but unmistakable. He looked away the moment he realized he had been caught, returning to his usual pretense of ignoring her. But Jessica knew what she had seen. There was something in that glance beyond the usual indifference. Curiosity, discomfort, doubt. She didn't know. But something changed in him when he saw her pregnant. That night, after a long day, Jessica lay down and closed her eyes, trying to find some rest. But when the silence fell over the house, she heard a sound coming from Daniel's room. A low murmur, almost a whisper lost in the dark. "We are both outcasts." Jessica held her breath. He didn't know she was listening. He didn't know his words had crossed the cold walls of the mansion and echoed inside her. For the first time since she arrived, she felt like there might be more to him than that icy exterior. That behind the bitterness, the distance, and the curt commands, Daniel Anderson wasn't just a difficult man. Maybe he was alone too. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. That morning, as Jessica tidied up Daniel's room, she felt the weight of the silence surrounding her. The man, as always, remained distant, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, seemingly lost in a world that was inaccessible to her. The only sound in the room was the soft swish of the damp cloth over the furniture. Moving carefully, Jessica picked up forgotten books, adjusted cushions, and folded a blanket that seemed unused for a long time. It was then that, while opening a drawer in a sideboard, she found something that made her hesitate, a photograph, yellowed with age. In the picture, a blonde woman smiled next to Daniel. Her eyes were lively, radiant, and there was a genuine happiness captured in that snapshot. But it wasn't that caught Jessica's attention. What made her catch her breath was the fact that Daniel was standing in the photo, without the wheelchair, without the burden of bitterness that now clouded his gaze. He was watching her. Jessica didn't need to look to confirm. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing her reaction, perhaps waiting for a question, a comment. But she said nothing. She simply returned the photo to its place, closing the drawer gently. When she raised her eyes, she found his. For the first time, Daniel didn't look away. The silence that followed was thick, laden with unspoken meanings. Jessica saw something there in those dark eyes that she had never seen before. A deep pain, a silent mourning, but as always, Daniel was the first to retreat. Without saying anything, he turned his face, closing off any possibility of conversation. Jessica continued her work, but something inside her had shifted. She wanted to understand who that woman was, and more than that, she wanted to understand who Daniel Anderson had been before he was reduced to the reclusive man who now inhabited that mansion. That night, The weather was unstable. The wind made the tree branches bang against the windows, and distant thunder signaled an impending storm. Jessica slept, but her rest was light, as it always had been since she arrived. It was a dull thud that woke her. Her heart raced immediately. It took a second to realize the sound was coming from Daniel's room. She got up quickly and walked out, feeling the cold air of the corridor envelop her skin. His door was ajar, and a faint light leaked out from the gap. She pushed it open, finding Daniel hunched over the bed, his face tense, sweat beads trickling down his forehead. His fingers were digging into his leg, right where the end of his amputated limb was. "Damn phantom pain," he murmured between clenched teeth, trying to control his breathing but failing miserably. Jessica hesitated. She didn't know whether she should approach, whether her presence would be welcome. But seeing him like that, so vulnerable, stirred something inside her. Without thinking too much, she moved closer and knelt beside his wheelchair. "Breathe with me," she said, lightly touching his hand. He looked at her, surprised. There was something in that look, a mixture of exhaustion and distrust. "I don't need your help," he muttered, his voice raspy. Jessica didn't pull back. "Then pretend I'm not here," she replied, keeping her hand on his. "But breathe." For a moment, Daniel seemed to resist. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. But then, very slowly, he closed his eyes and began to follow her breathing rhythm. It was the first time he allowed himself to be touched without pulling away. When the spasm passed, Daniel exhaled as though he had been holding an unbearable weight inside of him. He still didn't look at Jessica, but he didn't pull his hand away either. The silence between the two of them felt different now. It was no longer an abyss of distance, but a space where something new was beginning to emerge. "Why do you care?" he asked finally, his voice softer than before. Jessica swallowed. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind," she answered without hesitation. His eyes locked with hers. There was a silent understanding there, as if, for a moment, they were mirrors of one another. And then, very slowly, Daniel squeezed her hand. It wasn't a gesture of affection, nor a request for help. It was simply a recognition, an invisible bond. When Jessica returned to her room, her heart was still pounding. She sat on the bed, feeling the adrenaline gradually dissipate. Something was changing, and for the first time since she arrived there, she didn't feel completely alone. Maybe Daniel wasn't either. The days turned into weeks, and Jessica realized something had changed. It wasn't something Daniel said, because he continued to be economical with words, but it was there, in the small details, in the way his eyes followed her discreetly around the room, in the way his expression would harden when she moved away, in the subtle hesitation before he dismissed her with his usual coldness. At first, she thought she was imagining things. Maybe she was reading too much into it, confusing attention with mere curiosity. But then came the inevitable realization. Daniel Anderson was looking at her differently. He tried to hide it. He would always look away at the last second, pretending the observation had never happened. But Jessica saw it. She saw how his posture would stiffen when she came too close, how his fingers would tap impatiently on the table when their conversation lasted longer than he intended, how his eyes, though dark, seemed to carry a doubt that hadn't been there before, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she felt it too. It was on a stormy night that everything became impossible to avoid. The rain was battering the mansion's windows, and a loud thunderclap made the glass tremble. Jessica, unable to sleep, had sought refuge in the library. It was one of the few places in the house that still carried a little warmth. Books piled up on high shelves, and the soft light from the table lamp cast delicate shadows across the room. She was flipping through an old book when she heard the unmistakable sound of wheels gliding across the wooden floor. Her body tensed before she even turned around. Daniel was standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her. The expression on his face was unreadable. There was something there, a weight, an internal conflict that he made no effort to hide. Unlike the other times, he didn't look away when their gazes met. "Can't sleep?" she asked, trying to ignore the way her own breathing had become uneven. He took a second before answering. "You scare me," he said simply. Jessica furrowed her brow. "Why?" He ran a hand over his face, as if he were tired. But it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, something that seemed to consume him from the inside out. "Because you see me," he replied, "and I don't want to be seen." The words hung in the air heavy. Jessica felt her heart hammer against her ribs. This was Daniel Anderson, the man who had treated her like she was invisible from day one. The man who locked himself in his own pain, refusing any kind of connection. And now he was here, admitting what he had been trying to hide. She could say many things that he didn't need to hide, that there was no shame in being seen, but something in his posture told her that those weren't the words he needed to hear. So she said nothing. She simply held his gaze, and that was enough. The silence between them was like a lit fuse. The tension, which had been hovering between them for days, became palpable. Jessica noticed when Daniel tightened his grip on the armrests of his chair, when his jaw locked, when his breathing became irregular. And then suddenly he pulled her. It was quick, abrupt, as if he were surrendering to something he had been resisting for too long. The kiss wasn't gentle, it wasn't delicate, it was intense, desperate. As if, for one brief moment, Daniel had forgotten all the barriers he had put between them. Jessica felt his hands gripping her tightly, as if he were afraid she would disappear. And even though she knew she should pull away, that it was dangerous, that Daniel was a broken man, and she herself carried her own scars, she couldn't. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. The world disappeared, the rain, the wind, the cold mansion. All that remained was the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Daniel ran a hand over his face, as if trying to regain control of himself, but Jessica knew. They both knew. There was no going back. Daniel still felt the taste of her on his lips. The kiss they had shared in the library echoed inside him like a sin he couldn't regret. He had tried to sleep, tried to ignore what had happened. But every time he closed his eyes, he felt Jessica's touch, her quickened breath mingling with his, her eyes filled with something he didn't know how to name, or maybe something he was just afraid to recognize. Now, here he was, in the middle of the night, standing in front of her door. The entire house was submerged in silence, but inside him, a storm was brewing. His rational side screamed for him to turn away, to pretend that nothing had happened. But his feet refused to obey. His hand hovered in the air, just inches from knocking on the door. But before he could gather the courage, it opened. Jessica stood there, wearing a simple nightgown, her hair slightly messy from the pillow. Her eyes met his, and Daniel knew in that moment that she already knew. She knew he was there, and she knew why. Neither of them said a word. There was no need to. Jessica simply stepped back, a silent invitation. He entered. Her room was small, but Daniel didn't look around. His focus was entirely on her. The air between them felt heavy, laden with something inevitable. When he finally raised his hand to touch her, Jessica didn't pull back. He gently pulled her closer. She wasn't fragile, she wasn't too delicate for him. She was strong, stronger than anyone had ever been with him. "I'm a broken man," Daniel confessed, his voice rough, as if it was a secret he had never dared to say out loud. Jessica's eyes shone in the dim light of the room. "I was rejected by my own family," she replied, "but I'm here." The simple truth, said so firmly, pierced Daniel like a sharp blade. His hand slowly rose, tracing the outline of her face, memorizing every detail. He didn't know what he was doing, He just knew that he couldn't stop. When she kissed him, he didn't hesitate. This time there was no rush, no desperation. It was a deeper kiss, more intense, filled with everything they had never been able to say to each other. The night unfolded between hesitant touches that soon became certain, between bodies that learned each other with care and desire, between whispered words in the dark, between silent truths that were said without the need for words. In that small room, in that narrow bed, Daniel Anderson allowed himself to forget everything. They allowed themselves to exist only there, only with each other. When sleep finally came, it was peaceful. Jessica fell asleep first, her body relaxed, her face serene. Daniel watched her for a while, his chest rising and falling slowly. Then, without realizing it, his hand found her belly. His thumb traced a soft path over the stretched skin, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Anderson felt something different. Maybe he still had a home. Maybe, without realizing it, he had already found it. The sun streamed through the thin curtains of the service room, casting golden beams over the untidy sheets. Jessica felt the soft warmth against her skin, even before she opened her eyes. Her body still carried the sensation of Daniel's touches, the weight of his breath against her skin, the words that didn't need to be said. And then, when she finally woke up fully, she realized he was still there. Daniel lay beside her, propped up on one elbow, his dark eyes wandering over her face before they drifted down to her belly. His fingers traced slow circles on the stretched skin, such a delicate and unexpected gesture that Jessica's chest tightened. "You look even more beautiful like this," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. Jessica smiled, feeling a warmth inside her that wasn't just desire. It was something dangerous because it felt too much like happiness. But the spell didn't last long. The shrill sound of the doorbell shattered the moment like a blade. Jessica jumped out of bed, pulling the sheet against her body. Daniel furrowed his brow, already sensing that something was wrong. "Who could that be at this hour?" he asked, but she was already out of bed, getting dressed quickly. Her instincts screamed that this was not a good sign. As she crossed the hall and reached the front door of the mansion, she felt a heaviness in her chest. The air felt colder, as if the house sensed what was about to happen. She opened the door and froze. Ryan stood there, the man who could be the father of her child, the man with whom, for a brief and unfortunate moment, she thought she could build something, only to realize how wrong she had been. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was loaded with arrogance, with something malicious and calculated. "I see you've found a place to hide," he taunted, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe, as if he were too comfortable for someone who shouldn't be there. Jessica felt her blood boil. Her first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but her feet felt frozen to the ground. "I'm not hiding," she replied, keeping her voice steady even though she felt like she was falling apart inside. "Oh, really?" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Then it's just a coincidence that you disappeared without a trace." His gaze dropped to her belly. "And, conveniently, found such a luxurious place to settle down." The insinuation in his tone made her shiver. Before she could respond, she heard the familiar sound of Daniel's wheelchair gliding across the floor. She didn't need to turn to know he was behind her. His presence filled the space, bringing with it a biting cold. "What do you want?" Daniel's voice was firm, laden with something Jessica hadn't heard from him before. It wasn't just irritation. It was something darker. Ryan finally tore his eyes away from Jessica and looked at Daniel for the first time. Then he smiled. "So it's you," he said, the tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. "The new protector of Jessica." Jessica felt her stomach turn. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She looked from one man to the other, trying to understand what was happening. Daniel didn't respond right away, but his eyes were fixed on Ryan in a way that made the tension in the air nearly unbearable. They knew each other. Jessica didn't need to ask to know that. She could see it in the way Daniel gripped the arms of his chair with force. She could see it in the way Ryan leaned casually against the doorframe, as if he already knew exactly what was going on. "How do you two know each other?" Jessica finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Ryan looked at her, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, he didn't tell you?" he said with a short laugh. "How strange. I thought after sharing a bed you two would have exchanged some past stories." Jessica felt a chill crawl up her spine. She turned to Daniel, waiting for an answer, but his face was closed off, his jaw clenched, his dark eyes like the night. He didn't deny it. He didn't say anything. And that was worse than any answer he could have given. Ryan wasn't there just to see her. It wasn't curiosity or resentment. There was something more. And then he placed a brown envelope on the table by the door. "Business," he said simply, as though it were an insignificant detail. Daniel remained expressionless, but his hand gripped the armrests of his chair tightly. "Business?" he repeated, his voice low, filled with distrust. "Exactly," Ryan replied, clearly amused by the tension he had created. "My boss sent me to deliver these documents. Just a job, nothing personal." Jessica looked from one man to the other, feeling lost in this silent game. Ryan spoke with disdain, but Daniel reacted as if something here was much bigger than she could understand. Ryan took advantage of the silence. "Come on, Daniel," he continued, feigning lightness. "No need to act like I'm a stranger. After all, we've been on the same side, haven't we?" Jessica felt a shiver run down her spine. "On the same side?" she repeated, the tension in her voice obvious. Daniel finally took the envelope from the table, not looking away from Ryan. His face was unreadable, his expression closed. "The conversation is over," he said, his tone firm and final. But Ryan didn't retreat. Instead, he smiled, a venomous smile. "Jessica never told you who the father of the child was, did she?" he said casually. "I wonder if it's because she doesn't even know herself." The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Jessica froze. Daniel's expression remained unchanged for a second, but then, very slowly, his jaw tightened, and his fingers gripped the papers with more force. She felt her face flush, but it wasn't shame. It was anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," Jessica said firmly. Ryan took a step forward, as if he wanted to see her reaction up close. "Don't I?" He chuckled softly. "If you're so sure, then why are you so nervous?" Jessica wanted to scream, to slam the door, to end this conversation right there. But it wasn't her anger that stopped her. It was the fact that Daniel, instead of responding, looked away. She felt a tightness in her chest. "That doesn't change anything," she said quickly, as if speaking to Daniel, not Ryan. But Daniel didn't look at her. He gripped the papers tightly, as though they were the only thing anchoring him. His eyes were fixed on the envelope, but his mind seemed miles away. The doubt had already been planted. Without saying another word, Daniel turned his chair and began to leave the room. "I need time to think," was all he said. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. No, it couldn't end like this. But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He just disappeared down the hallway, taking with him all the ground she thought she had beneath her feet. Ryan watched it all with a satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Well," he said, straightening his coat, "that was easier than I expected." Jessica turned to him, feeling a rising fury. "Get out of my house!" He raised his hands in mock surrender. "As you wish," he said with a smile. "But I'll be back, because whether you like it or not, Jessica, you still have a choice to make." And with that, he left, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the trail of chaos that seemed to follow him. Jessica stood there alone, feeling her heart race unevenly. Would Daniel come back? Daniel crossed the hallway like a man on the edge of a cliff. Ryan's words hammered in his mind, mixed with the echo of his own fears. Jessica never told you who the father of the child was, did she? I wonder if it's because she doesn't even know herself." He wanted to ignore it, pretend those words had no effect on him. But Daniel knew it was a lie. He shut the door to his office behind him and took a deep breath, leaning his hands on the desk. His head was heavy, his mind torn between everything he had lived before Jessica and everything he could lose now. He grabbed the envelope Ryan had left and opened it with tense fingers. He skimmed the pages quickly, his eyes scanning contracts and numbers, but his mind couldn't process any of it. The only thing that mattered now was Jessica. Doubt crept into him like poison, eating away at every certainty he had felt in the past few days. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust. But throughout his life, trusting had always been a mistake. First, he trusted that his life would always be safe, that he would never face a fall so great, that he would always be in control, and then he trusted that he would never care about anyone again. Until Jessica came along. She changed everything. She entered his life without asking for permission. She confronted his coldness without fear. She touched him when no one else dared. And now he was terrified. Because if Ryan was right, if Jessica really didn't know who the father of the child was, then maybe Daniel was throwing himself into something he couldn't control, and nothing scared him more than losing control. He closed his eyes and squeezed the envelope with force before tossing it aside. Ryan's business could wait. Jessica couldn't. With newfound determination, he turned his chair and left the office. When he stopped in front of her door, he hesitated for a second. He wasn't sure what he wanted to hear, but he needed to know the truth. He knocked once. Jessica took a moment to open the door. When she did, she didn't seem surprised to see him there. "Do you really not know who the father is?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. Her eyes, which had been a mix of fatigue and anguish until that point, narrowed. "If I knew, I would have told you," she answered firmly, without hesitation. Daniel held his breath. She didn't try to soften the truth. She didn't try to convince him. She simply said what needed to be said, without fear of his reaction. That should have been enough. But the past had always taught Daniel that love didn't come without betrayal, that trusting people meant preparing to be stabbed in the back sooner or later. And now, here he was. If he had learned anything in his life, it was that no one could be saved twice. "I don't want this to tear us apart," Jessica whispered, her voice thick with vulnerability. Daniel blinked slowly as if absorbing those words. It was so simple for her. But for him, trusting meant giving someone the power to destroy him. Jessica kept her eyes on his. With each passing second, Daniel felt like he was being pulled into something he wouldn't come out of unscathed. She wasn't lying, he knew that. But the fear of allowing himself to believe was greater than any certainty. The silence stretched on for long seconds, until Daniel moved. Without a word, he reached out and pulled her close. The smell of her, the warmth of her body against his, the sound of their breathing speeding up. Everything in him told him it was wrong. Everything in him told him it was right. "I can't change your past," he murmured, his voice heavy with something Jessica couldn't decipher. "But I want to be in your future." Her eyes shimmered, and a quiet sob escaped her lips. "I never wanted anything but that," she whispered, closing her eyes as she pressed her forehead to his. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Slowly, his hand slid down to her belly. His fingers traced a hesitant path, as though for the first time he truly saw the life growing inside her. "This child may not be mine by blood," he said, his voice wavering, "but if you allow me, he will be mine by heart." Jessica let the tears fall. It was everything she wanted, and everything Daniel never thought he would desire. But there he was, choosing, for the first time, to surrender to what he felt. The days that followed were a mixture of calm and unease. Jessica and Daniel had weathered the worst of the storm, but there were still shadows around them. Both of their pasts weren't something that could easily be erased, and while Daniel had made his choice, something inside her still waited for the next blow of fate. She knew Ryan wasn't the kind of man to just disappear without a final act. So, when the doorbell rang that afternoon, her body tensed even before she reached the door. Her instincts were right. Ryan was there, but something about him was different. The arrogance still existed, but it was worn down. The mocking gleam in his eyes had faded a little, as if something inside him had changed too. Jessica crossed her arms, feeling tired even before the conversation began. "What do you want now?" she asked, not bothering to hide her impatience. Ryan didn't answer right away. He simply shoved his hand in the pocket of his coat and pulled out an envelope. He extended it to her without any theatrics. "I signed it," he said simply. "I'm giving up any claim on the child." Jessica blinked, confused. Her eyes moved from the envelope to Ryan's face, searching for any sign of manipulation, any hidden agenda. "Why?" Her voice was low, suspicious. Ryan shrugged, but his face no longer held the usual indifferent expression. "Because I've never been a real man when it comes to owning up to anything," he confessed. "Maybe this is my last chance to do something right." Those words hit her in an unexpected way. Ryan wasn't a good man. He'd never pretended to be. But for some reason, seeing him here, admitting his inability to be a father, made something tighten inside her chest. She took the envelope slowly, her fingers hesitating, as though she feared it was all a trap. When she opened it and skimmed through the papers, she saw the signatures, the legal terms. It was all there. It was done. A deep relief washed over her, but it didn't entirely erase the sense of disbelief. "So, is this it?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the documents. "You sign a paper, and everything just disappears." Ryan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You'd prefer I stayed?" he asked. Jessica raised her gaze, and for a moment there was a heavy silence between them. No, she didn't want him to stay. That was never the issue, but the ease with which he was walking away, even if it was the right thing to do, still made her uncomfortable. Ryan sighed and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized as something close to frustration. "Look, Jessica, I'm no good at this," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "I've never been. I never will be. You know that better than anyone." She didn't answer. Ryan narrowed his eyes, and before he could say anything else, he looked over her shoulder. And that's when Jessica felt it. Daniel was standing there. She turned and found him standing a few feet away, watching the scene in silence. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, analyzing every detail. Ryan smiled, but it was an empty smile. "So, this is it," he muttered, shaking his head lightly. "You two together. I never thought I'd see the great Daniel Anderson playing this game." Jessica felt Daniel move closer, stopping beside her. His presence was a warning, a wall between her and Ryan. But Ryan didn't seem intimidated. He turned to Daniel, his eyes sizing him up with something that wasn't quite hostility, but certainly wasn't respect. "But what about you?" Ryan asked, tilting his head slightly. "Are you going to handle this?" The provocation in his voice was clear. Jessica looked at Daniel, waiting for his response, feeling the tension rise between them. But Daniel didn't hesitate. "I've already made my choice," he replied, his voice firm and certain. Ryan held his gaze for a moment, as if waiting to find some uncertainty in him. When he didn't, he let out a short, lifeless laugh. "Good luck, then," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You'll need it." And with that, he turned and walked away. Jessica didn't move until she heard the sound of his car engine fading into the distance. Then she let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When she finally looked at Daniel, she found his eyes already on her. She felt something inside her settle. For months, she had lived under the shadow of that uncertainty. She had prepared herself to fight for every piece of the life she wanted to build, expecting the moment when everything could fall apart. But now, no one could take her away from here. No one could separate them. Daniel wasn't just a broken man, he was the man who chose to stay. And for the first time, Jessica knew with absolute certainty, he was the man she wanted to spend her life with. The absence of Ryan brought an unexpected peace. For the first time since she arrived at that house, Jessica felt like she could breathe without the fear that everything would be taken from her once again. The nights were quieter, the days had a new lightness to them. Daniel, though he still carried shadows inside, seemed more present. There was a different touch in his gaze when he looked at her, a clearer care in his gestures. He was no longer the reclusive man who avoided her presence. Now, he was someone who chose to be by her side. And it was for that reason that night, when she descended the stairs and found the living room lit by dozens of candles, with the soft fragrance of fresh flowers in the air, her heart skipped a beat. She stopped at the last step, confused. The dining table, which normally remained empty, was carefully set. A bottle of wine rested in the center next to two perfectly aligned plates. Red roses were scattered around the room, bringing an unexpected contrast to the severity of the house. "What is this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Daniel was there, in front of her, wearing a dark shirt that fitted him perfectly. He had made an effort, and that alone was surprising. He rolled his wheelchair slightly forward and took her hand, pulling her close. "Something I should have done a long time ago." The tone of his voice made Jessica's chest tighten. It was rare to see him so open, so vulnerable. She let herself be guided to the table, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers. When she sat down, Daniel remained close, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never planned on having someone again," he began, his voice steady, but laden with emotion. "In fact, I spent too much time believing I didn't deserve this, that I was destined to be alone. But with you—" He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I don't just want to try. I want to make this work." Jessica felt her eyes burn. She never needed grand promises. She never expected Daniel to be a man of romantic words or excessive gestures. But in that moment, she felt he was giving her something much bigger, his total surrender. He pulled something from his pocket, and her heart stopped for a second when she saw the silver gleam reflecting the light of the candles. Daniel held up a small open box in front of her. Inside, a delicate ring glistened, simple, yet full of meaning. "Will you marry me?" The words were direct, without adornment, but Daniel's jaw was tight, as though he was holding his breath, waiting for her answer. Jessica felt her heart race. She knew she loved him. She knew that without him, she didn't want to go back to who she was before, but she never expected this to come so soon. "Daniel." She blinked, trying to make sure this was real. "Are you sure?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "If I had any doubts, do you think I would be here now, asking you this?" She couldn't hold back a smile. Yes, this was Daniel, the man who didn't do anything unless he was completely sure. And she loved him just like that. Jessica felt a sob rise in her throat before finally whispering, "Yes." The relief on Daniel's face was instant. He exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for years. He took her hand gently and slid the ring onto her finger, sealing a commitment that for both of them had existed long before that night. Then he lifted his gaze and looked at her in a way that made her skin tingle. "Now you're mine, officially." Jessica laughed softly, feeling her heart so full it seemed like it would explode. That was the beginning of something new. Later, already in their room, they were lying down, surrounded by the comfortable silence of the night. Jessica nestled against Daniel, feeling the warmth of his body, the weight of his arm around her. The exhaustion of the day was beginning to overtake her when she felt a strange movement. She stopped for a moment, trying to understand if it was just her imagination. But then it came again. Her heart raced. Jessica and Daniel's wedding wouldn't be grand. There would be no guests, no live music, no ballroom filled with flowers. But to her, it was everything she had ever dreamed of, because for the first time, she was by the side of someone who truly chose to stay. The morning of the wedding dawned with a clear sky and a light breeze coming through the mansion's windows. It was as though even the weather was different, lighter, as if the very universe recognized that this day was special. Jessica looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The dress was simple, made of white fabric that flowed gently over her body and embraced her belly. Time was passing too quickly, and she could already feel the weight of motherhood in every detail of her silhouette. But, unlike the fear she had once felt, now there was peace. Karen entered the room without knocking, as she always did, but this time her expression didn't carry the usual impatience. "You look beautiful," she said simply, her voice softer than usual. Jessica smiled. She knew that, in her own way, that was the closest Karen could come to giving a compliment. "Thank you." Karen hesitated for a moment, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle in the bedspread. "He's waiting downstairs," she informed her before leaving without saying anything else. Jessica took a deep breath and walked down the hallway, slowly descending the stairs. With each step, she felt her heart beat faster. It wasn't nervousness, it was emotion. When she reached the main room, the air seemed to leave her lungs. Daniel was there, waiting for her. He was wearing a dark suit, simple but perfectly tailored. His hair was impeccable, and even sitting in his wheelchair, he radiated the firm presence he had always had. But what touched her the most was his gaze. He was looking at her as though he was seeing something precious. Jessica had never felt as beautiful as she did in that moment. The justice of the peace was ready, with the papers spread out on the table. Karen stood by, being the only witness to the union. It was funny to think that not long ago that woman had received her with coldness and distrust, and now she was the only one witnessing this moment. Jessica stopped in front of Daniel, and he took her hand naturally. His fingers were warm, firm. The justice of the peace began to speak, but she barely heard the words. All that existed was Daniel, his dark eyes fixed on hers, his breathing calm and controlled. When it was time for the vows, Daniel didn't hesitate. "I promise to love you, even on the difficult days," he said, his voice deep but full of emotion. "I promise to be by your side when life feels too heavy, and to remind you every day that you are not alone." Jessica felt her throat tighten. "I promise to remind you every day that you deserve to be loved," she replied, her voice breaking. "I promise I will never let you forget that you don't have to carry everything alone." The justice of the peace asked for the rings, and Daniel took the small silver ring, gently sliding it onto Jessica's finger. When she did the same, a shiver ran through her body. It was real. It was forever. "Now you are officially married," the justice of the peace declared. Before Jessica even processed the words, Daniel pulled her hand firmly and brought her close. She felt his breath against hers, and then their lips met. The kiss was intense, but not rushed. There was no desperation, only the certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. When they pulled away, Jessica noticed that Karen had turned her gaze, busying herself with a book on the shelf, pretending she hadn't witnessed anything. "Now you're mine officially," Daniel whispered against her lips. Jessica laughed softly, feeling her heart so full it seemed like it would explode. That was the beginning of something new. Later, already in their room, they were lying down, surrounded by the comfortable silence of the night. Jessica nestled against Daniel, feeling the warmth of his body, the weight of his arm around her. The exhaustion of the day began to take over when she felt a strange movement. She stopped for a moment, trying to understand if it was just her imagination, but then it came again. Her heart raced. "Daniel!" she whispered, her voice filled with surprise. He slowly opened his eyes, confused by the tone of her voice. "What?" Jessica took his hand and guided it to her belly. "He wants to meet you," she whispered. For a moment, Daniel remained still, and then, under his palm, he felt the little kick. The air seemed to leave the room. Jessica saw when his breath faltered, when his jaw tightened, when his eyes shone with something she had never seen before. He swallowed hard and closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the moment. When he opened them again, a small smile appeared on his lips. "I can't wait." Jessica felt a lump in her throat. If there was one thing life had taught her, it was that fate, as cruel as it could be, sometimes guides people exactly where they're meant to be. And now, looking at Daniel, feeling their child move for the first time, she knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first light of morning entered the room softly, filtering through the half-open curtains and spreading across the wooden floor. The golden glow of the sun touched the disheveled sheets, revealing the tranquility of that dawn. Jessica blinked slowly, allowing herself to wake up gradually, feeling the warmth of the body beside hers. Daniel was still asleep, his breathing calm and steady. His face seemed lighter than usual, free from the weight of the pain that so often hardened his features. She turned to her side, propping her head up with one hand, and watched him for a few moments. Every detail of the man lying there, the contour of his jaw, the way his dark lashes contrasted with his tan skin, the discreet scar on his chin, was part of the man who had changed her life. And she loved him. With an intensity she had never imagined she could feel. She ran her fingers gently along his arm, tracing invisible paths over his skin. Daniel shifted slightly, a sigh escaping his lips before he opened his eyes. When their gazes met, he smiled. "Already awake?" he murmured, his voice husky from sleep. Jessica smiled back, sliding her fingers between his and intertwining them. "I didn't want to miss this," she replied. He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Miss what?" "This moment," she whispered, pressing her fingers tighter against his. Daniel took a deep breath and turned slightly toward her, bringing his hand to her face. His thumb traced a slow path across Jessica's cheek before he whispered, "Me neither." She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that feeling of peace, of belonging. When she opened her eyes again, her chest was filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. "I never imagined I would find this," she said softly. Daniel looked at her for a moment, his eyes taking in every detail of her expression before he finally murmured, "Neither did I." There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, that filled the space between two people who didn't need words to understand each other. Then Daniel squeezed her hand and added, "But now that I've found it, I don't want to spend another day without you." Jessica's chest tightened, and she felt her eyes sting. "You'll never have to," she promised. He smiled and pulled her closer, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. The mansion, once cold, now had life. The hallways, once lonely, now echoed with laughter, footsteps, conversations at nightfall. It was no longer a place of dark memories or silent pain. It was a home. And all of this was because, against all odds, love found a way to grow between the ruins of their pains. Jessica remembered when she first arrived there. The weight of her family's rejection, the fear of the future, the feeling of being nothing but a burden in the world. She remembered how she had been received with distrust, the loneliness of that first small room. She remembered looking at Daniel and seeing him as an unbearable man, a bitter recluse who didn't want her there. And now she was married to him. Now he was her family. She was no longer the scared girl who had been kicked out of her house. She was a woman who had found her place. Her heart raced when she felt a small movement inside her. The baby. Jessica placed her hand on her belly, a smile forming on her lips. Daniel noticed the gesture and frowned. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern in his voice. She took his hand and placed it over her belly. "He's moving," she whispered. Daniel's hand stilled for a moment, but then, as if the baby felt his presence, there was a stronger movement. Jessica saw his eyes widen, his breath falter. He stood still for long seconds, processing what he had just felt. And then softly, as if speaking only to himself, he murmured, "You saved me." Jessica smiled, tears silently rolling down her face. "No," she corrected. "We saved each other." He lifted his gaze to hers, and in that moment, there were no more doubts, no more shadows, only the two of them, and the life they had chosen together. Everything was exactly as it should be.